Some crimes are loud, dramatic, heard by all. But others slip in unnoticed, like the faintest hint of poison in a meal, lingering just enough to twist fate. The quiet resentment, the hidden grief. How far will a forgotten past go to claim its revenge? Tonight, you'll hear a tale not just of murder, but of a life lived in shadows, and the shocking consequences of letting bitterness simmer too long. On a crisp, invigorating spring afternoon, the quaint village of St. Mary's was draped in the soft, almost ethereal green of budding hedges, their fresh leaves shimmering in the gentle breeze, while the air seemed to hum with the early stirrings of birds, chirping prematurely, as if summer had arrived ahead of time. From the comfort of her favorite armchair by the parlor window, Miss Jane Marple observed the scene outside, her sharp eyes quietly cataloguing the small, familiar details of village life that so often escaped others' notice. A china cup of Darjeeling, the steam still rising in delicate curls, sat perfectly balanced on its saucer, while a half-knitted baby bonnet rested in her lap. Her knitting needles were still for the moment, though her mind, ever alert, was a whirlwind of thought, examining the tiniest nuances that most people would overlook. From her small writing desk, she had just pulled out a letter, one from her niece Joan, Raymond's wife, as Miss Marple's mind recalled. It was written on thick, cream-colored paper, the kind that always felt luxurious to the touch, in a light, artistic script that seemed to dance across the page. The faintest scent of violets lingered, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to her practiced senses. Miss Marple read the letter carefully, pausing after each line, her pale blue eyes narrowing ever so slightly at a particularly striking passage. "You must meet him, Aunt Jane," the letter began. "Sir Cedric Derway. He's quite the rage in London at the moment. Florence Gresham has invited him to stay at Gresham Hall for the upcoming village fete. He's promised to unveil a secret recipe that's simply to die for. His words, not mine." Miss Marple's lips tightened in a barely perceptible frown. She had lived long enough to know that words, especially those spoken too casually, or without much thought, often carried deeper meanings than their speakers realized. And something about the careless nature of the phrase, "to die for," stirred an uncomfortable feeling in the pit of her stomach. Lady Florence Gresham, a woman whose taste for social drama was well known throughout the village, was not one to shy away from a public spectacle. In fact, since the untimely death of her husband the previous autumn, Florence had thrown herself into village life with an almost frantic zeal. She hosted poetry readings, musical recitals, and now, in what seemed like an act of calculated showmanship, had invited one of London's most flamboyant chefs to demonstrate his skills in the sleepy village of St. Mary. Sir Cedric Derway, a man of both culinary repute and theatrical flair, was as famous for his dramatic entrances as he was for his signature risotto. Tall and silver-haired, with an air of elegance and mystery, Derway was known for his flair, having once allegedly paraded a lobster in Buckingham Palace, though of course the details of this story were always subject to embellishment. Now he would descend upon the quiet village, bringing with him what he termed gastronomic theatre, a concept that made Miss Marple's instincts tingle. Florence had arranged for Derway to stay at Gresham Hall for an entire fortnight in preparation for the grand fete. During this time, the villagers were to be treated to a display of the chef's culinary prowess, culminating in the presentation of his secret recipe, a dish he claimed to have discovered during his travels in Naples. He insisted that it would stir the senses, provoke the soul, and with a mischievous glint in his eye, perhaps even kill a man. This last remark in particular set Miss Marple's mind racing. She raised an eyebrow, as her experience had taught her to be wary of such seemingly playful statements. The following days saw the village of St. Mary's abuzz with chatter. In the local greengrocer's, during Sunday service, and over slices of Battenberg at the Women's Institute, Sir Cedric's upcoming appearance was the only topic of conversation. The butcher's wife recounted with great enthusiasm how she had seen him on television flambeing a duck with brandy, while old Mr. Merriweather grumbled that food which smoked like a chimney was never to be trusted. But what truly set the village alight was a rumor that came from the most unlikely of sources: the vicar's daughter. She claimed with all the authority of youth and inexperience that Sir Cedric's secret recipe had been banned in several parts of Europe due to its potentially overwhelming effects. The villagers were at once intrigued and terrified, yet no one could offer any explanation as to what those effects might be. Still, the mystery only added to the growing excitement, and the fate became the most anticipated event since the bishop's visit back in 1932. Miss Marple, meanwhile, observed the growing frenzy with a quiet amusement, though a faint crease of concern formed between her brows. The excitement felt almost feverish, too eager, too frantic for a mere village celebration, and in her long years of observation, she had come to understand that when emotions ran high, something far darker often lurked beneath the surface. The day of the fete arrived, bright and clear, with the sky as blue as the petals of the village's beloved bluebells. The scent of freshly cut grass filled the air as bunting fluttered in the breeze, and the entire village turned out in its Sunday best. The event was a patchwork of simple pleasures: homemade jams and preserves, a quilting competition, and a modest brass band whose charm lay in its distinct lack of precision. But it was the centerpiece of the afternoon that drew everyone's attention: Sir Cedric Derway's culinary tent. The tent was a spectacle in itself, outfitted with gleaming copper pans, pristine white linens, and a small raised platform where Derway stood, resplendent in his tailored apron, silver hair glinting in the sunlight. His every movement was an act, each flourish of the hand, each subtle tilt of the head, designed to captivate the audience. The dish he prepared was nothing short of a performance in itself: risotto della morte, a creamy herb-laced concoction, crafted with sweeping gestures and whispered flourishes. It was as much a work of art as it was a meal. When it was finally plated and presented to the distinguished guests, including Lady Florence and the retired Colonel Tobias Redden, the village held its breath. As the dish was served, there was a palpable tension in the air, as if everyone knew, deep down, that something was not quite right, though no one could quite put their finger on it. For Miss Marple, the scene was a familiar one. She had seen enough of the world's dramas and secrets to recognize when the smoke of a spectacle concealed something far darker. And though the villagers marveled at the dish before them, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that what lay hidden beneath the surface of Sir Cedric's culinary performance was something far more dangerous, and far more deadly, than anyone could possibly imagine. The crowd leaned in, their breath held as if awaiting a royal proclamation. Colonel Redden, ever the skeptic, made an offhand remark about continental nonsense before he scooped a generous spoonful from the plate, his sharp tongue still wagging with idle jest. But as soon as the dish crossed his lips, everything shifted. His face drained of color, his mouth twisted in silent shock, and within mere moments he staggered, clutching at his chest as if trying to grasp the very air that seemed to leave him. A collective gasp escaped from the villagers, as his body collapsed, crumpling like a marionette whose strings had been suddenly severed. His once proud figure now lay sprawled in an unnerving heap, his complexion turning a ghastly shade of gray, unearthly, unnatural. Panic spread like wildfire through the crowd. A shriek cut through the air, originating from behind the cake stall, followed by cries of, "Fetch a doctor! And he's not breathing!" The scene dissolved into chaos, as the once lively chatter of the fete became a cacophony of confusion, fear, and frantic movement. In the swirl of activity, most villagers clustered around in shock or scrambled to render aid. But not Miss Jane Marple. Calm and composed, she remained seated at the edge of the tent, her pale blue eyes behind those ever so familiar spectacles, not fixed on the fallen colonel, but on something far more significant. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, as it shifted to the preparation table. Sir Cedric stood there, pale and trembling, his hands wringing together in horror. His lips were moving, but only a single phrase escaped. It was just saffron, nothing harmful. His voice was strained, as though he could scarcely believe it himself. The constable tried to bring some semblance of order to the disarray, but it was clear that the heart of the village had faltered in the wake of what had just occurred. Miss Marple, however, did not flinch. Her gaze shifted once more, this time to a small detail that struck her as off. The salt container, which had been perched innocuously by Sir Cedric's elbow just moments before, was now missing, replaced by a faint dusting of a pale residue on the white cloth beneath it. The shift in the atmosphere was subtle, yet Miss Marple's mind, ever attuned to the undercurrents of human behavior, had already begun to trace the faintest of patterns. Her fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag, the familiar weight offering her a quiet comfort, as her mind sifted through the facts. Near the culinary station, a young maid stood frozen, her face the color of fresh chalk, her hands wringing the hem of her apron in a nervous tick. Millie Dawson, if Miss Marple recalled correctly, a quiet girl, rarely noticed and often dismissed. Yet today, Millie's wide eyes betrayed a far deeper knowledge, a silent panic in her gaze that spoke volumes. As the villagers erupted into clusters of speculation and disarray, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting needle still, her mind not dwelling on yarn or wool, but on the puzzle that lay before her. Dr. Griffith arrived shortly after, performing a swift and tense examination of the colonel, his grim face confirming what the crowd had already begun to suspect. Colonel Redden was dead. Likely heart failure, the doctor muttered, though the words seemed to hang in the air, more an attempt to placate than an explanation. His discomfort was palpable. The constable asked the usual questions, but Sir Cedric's protests of innocence were as shaky as his appearance. Lady Florence, pale and faint, was ushered away from the scene, her distress evident but not entirely convincing. Miss Marple, ever watchful, studied them all, not their words, but their silences. Sir Cedric's furtive glance at the remaining food, Lady Florence's trembling hands as she clutched at her gloves, these told a different story. And then there was Millie Dawson, slipping away when attention turned elsewhere. The dish had been sampled by several, but only the colonel had reacted with such a violent response. That, Miss Marple knew, was telling. With quiet deliberation, Miss Marple folded her knitting, the rhythmic motion betraying nothing of the storm of thoughts gathering in her mind. She had seen the many faces of evil in her long life, but never had it been presented so delicately, so artfully arranged. A touch of nutmeg, a dash of saffron, it all seemed so innocent, yet the timing, the precision, spoke of something far darker lurking beneath the surface. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows beneath the fluttering bunting, suspicion began to take root like a weed in the garden of St. Mary. By evening the official word had spread. Colonel Tobias Redden was dead. Griffith, uncomfortable, beneath the weight of the village's growing speculation, concluded with a strained tone, that the cause was likely cardiac failure, possibly triggered by stress or indigestion. The villagers, though unsettled, accepted it. After all, Colonel Redden had always seemed robust, despite his age. He had walked with the firmness of a soldier, his posture straight as an arrow, his weekly visits to the billiard hall, showing no sign of decline. But Miss Marple knew better. She had known the colonel for nearly 20 years. He had faced battlefields and broken marriages, but never once had he faltered under the weight of his own body. No, it was the timing that unsettled her most. A healthy man, collapsing so precisely after tasting that dish. That could not be mere coincidence. Yet Miss Marple did not challenge the doctor's verdict aloud, for she had learned long ago that some things, some truths, had to be unraveled at the right moment. As she sipped her chamomile tea in the quiet of her parlor, her thoughts were far from the soothing warmth of the brew. She had seen enough of the world's deceptions to recognize when something was far more sinister than it appeared, and in the undercurrents of that seemingly innocent dish, she knew, a deadly secret had been concealed, waiting to be discovered. The morning after the chaos, Miss Marple arrived at Gresham Hall, her arrival marked not by the usual cheerful greetings, but by a cloud of unease. She carried with her a small jar of rose-petal jam, her hands clasped firmly around it, as though it held not just the delicate sweetness, but the answers she sought. Lady Florence, still pale from the previous day's events, greeted her with a shaky smile, her fingers fluttering nervously at the edges of her shawl. "Miss Marple, your kindness is a balm," she whispered, her voice thin with distress. "I simply cannot shake the horror of it all. Tobias dead. At our fete. I never thought." The words trailed off as though the mere thought of her late husband was too much to bear. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her eyes sharp as ever despite the softened tone of her voice. "A tragedy indeed, my dear. Death does seem so misplaced in a place of celebration, doesn't it? Almost unnatural." Lady Florence dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though the glint of something more than sadness lingered in her gaze, as though a darker memory was clawing to surface. Miss Marple's gaze shifted then, subtle but knowing, to the table by the window where the Morning Post lay. 2 envelopes sat there, one ripped open, the other untouched, an insignificant detail that most would miss. But to Miss Marple, it whispered of something hidden, a forgotten conversation, or perhaps an unspoken plan. As she shifted her attention back to Lady Florence, her voice softened once again. "I trust you were near the culinary tent when the incident occurred. I understand it was all quite chaotic." Lady Florence's expression faltered, the faintest shadow crossing her features. Yes, I did sample the dish. Just a small spoonful, of course. Tobias, well, he was always the critic of such things. But then he fell, and it was all over before I could." She stopped herself, a flicker of something uneasy in her eyes. "Before you could what, my dear?" Miss Marple pressed gently, watching her intently. A flicker of discomfort passed across Lady Florence's face, a momentary breach in her composed exterior. "I suppose I didn't see much after that. It all happened so quickly. He was down. And then—" The pause hung heavily in the air, but Miss Marple offered no comment, merely storing the unease in her mind as she turned the conversation towards more familiar ground. Small talk, the weather, the plants blooming outside. The conversation shifted smoothly. But Miss Marple's thoughts, sharp and unyielding, remained fixed on the puzzle, the inconsistencies. Later, in the conservatory, Sir Cedric welcomed her with a disheveled air, a glass of cherry brandy in hand, his robe slightly askew, his demeanor one of exaggerated distress. "Miss Marple, what a nightmare. A man dies after tasting my dish. This will ruin everything. The papers will eat it up. And poor Florence, she's already cancelled the second demonstration. It's just all so unjust." His voice wavered between panic and rehearsed calm, and Miss Marple, ever the patient listener, allowed him to pour out his frustrations. "But I must ask," she began, her tone as gentle as the surrounding air, "do you often leave your ingredients open to others? Your spices, perhaps?" His response was quick and defensive, a sharp flicker of irritation cutting through the performance. "Certainly not. I am meticulous about my work. Everything is locked away, all my sauces labeled. No one touches the risotto except me. Well, Millie may have fetched the spoons, but that's all." Millie. Miss Marple's mind seized on the name, the quiet, unassuming maid, who had been so conspicuously still during the chaos. She allowed the conversation to drift before asking, as if casually, "And the salt shaker, was it misplaced during the commotion?" Cedric's brow furrowed slightly, his gaze momentarily unsettled. "Was it? I always place it to my left, you know, for ease. But I suppose it might have. I hadn't noticed." Miss Marple nodded with a faint smile, her mind now turning over this small but significant detail. She had seen it, only moments before the incident, a salt shaker, positioned meticulously at Cedric's side, now nowhere to be found. The habits of the left-handed chef, the locked spices, the quiet maid, and the missing salt, each piece of the puzzle seemed to align, though the picture it formed was still clouded in uncertainty. As she took her leave, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the other details she had collected throughout the day. The unopened envelope on the table, the flicker of discomfort in Lady Florence's eyes, the hesitancy in Sir Cedric's words. She had not spoken directly of the murder, nor did she intend to yet, but the pieces were slowly, silently, falling into place. Something far darker than mere accident had taken root here, and as always, It was the smallest of things that would reveal the truth. Miss Marple stood in the quiet garden, the evening sky painted with the soft hues of twilight, her gaze fixed on Dorothy, whose stillness could rival the tranquility of the setting. There was something about the girl's cold composure, a surface calm that masked deeper unrest, and Miss Marple knew this mask could only conceal so much. The death of Colonel Redfern, a man she had no particular fondness for, seemed to have unsettled the air around them, but it was not grief that lingered in the garden like a fog. It was something darker, a sense of unresolved bitterness. "I never asked for his care," Dorothy confessed softly, her voice trembling ever so slightly, as she folded her hands tighter in her lap, her eyes averted. "He controlled everything. My life, my future, even the people I could speak to. Henry, my fiancé, he said he was after my money." She stopped, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "There isn't even much left of it." Miss Marple, ever composed, did not flinch at this revelation. "And yet, you stayed," she observed, her words gentle but probing. Dorothy's gaze met hers for a fleeting moment, a crack in her stoic armor. "I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice breaking though she quickly regained her composure. "And no, I'm not sorry he's gone. Does that make me wicked?" The question hung in the air like a poisoned chalice, and Miss Marple, with her characteristic softness, answered, "No, my dear. It makes you honest." Dorothy blinked, the surprise evident in her eyes, as though she had expected condemnation. Miss Marple's smile was faint, but her mind was already working, turning over the details like pieces of a puzzle. The girl had motive, but that alone was never enough. What mattered now was whether she had the heart, and the opportunity to act on it. Later that evening, Miss Marple found herself seated in the Reverend Allerton's impeccably tidy study. The man, a picture of propriety, had poured her tea with a careful precision, his fingers steady despite the undercurrent of tension in the air. "I was not near the culinary tent when the incident occurred," the Reverend said, as if to preempt any probing. "I was at the donations table, inspecting contributions." Miss Marple smiled politely, her gaze unwavering. "Quite understandable. A tragic accident indeed." The Reverend's hand tightened around the teapot. "Yes, tragic," he echoed, though the word lacked conviction. "You and Colonel Redfern were not close, were you?" Miss Marple's question floated in the air like a whispered challenge. The Reverend's lips pressed together, his discomfort palpable. "He made some unfounded suggestions regarding parish finances," he muttered, his gaze darting away. "But nothing untoward, I assure you." Miss Marple nodded, her voice as placid as ever. "People do love stirring things, don't they?" she mused. "Did he ever threaten to report you?" The Reverend's discomfort deepened, his eyes avoiding hers. "He insinuated as much," he confessed, his voice strained. "But there was nothing improper. I simply redirected some funds to help the poor during the winter months, without filing the formal request. A technicality, really." Miss Marple's smile was warm, though her eyes betrayed the sharpness of her thoughts. "Bureaucracy. Such a bore," she murmured, her tone a gentle dismissal. As she rose to leave, her mind was already racing, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle, each interaction, every moment of hesitation, every unspoken word. The Reverend's carefully crafted image, the quiet bitterness of Dorothy, the hidden motives veiled beneath Lady Florence's prim exterior, all were connected by a thread, thin and fragile, yet undeniable. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was somewhere within those carefully constructed facades, waiting to be uncovered, and she would be the one to expose it, as she always did. The early morning sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen windows of Gresham Hall, casting long slender shadows across the gleaming tiles. The usually bustling scullery was eerily quiet, save for the steady swish of a mop against the tiled floor. Miss Marple moved through the space, with a deliberate calm, each step measured, her sharp eyes taking in every detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Millie Dawson, the young scullery maid, startled at the sound of approaching footsteps, her hands frozen mid-scrub. Her wide eyes met Miss Marple's, and in that brief glance, the older woman saw the unmistakable fear that lingered just beneath the surface of the girl's facade. "Good morning, Millie." Miss Marple greeted her in a soft, almost comforting tone. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything." The girl hastily returned to her task, but there was a subtle tension in her posture, a rigidity that spoke volumes about the state of her nerves. Miss Marple, sensing her discomfort, allowed a moment of silence to pass before speaking again. It must have been quite a shock. The events at the fete yesterday, she began, her voice casual but laced with something more, an almost imperceptible probing. You were quite close to the preparation table, weren't you? Millie's reaction was immediate and telling. Her body stiffened, her lips parted slightly as though searching for the right words. The hesitation was brief but enough to confirm Miss Marple's suspicions. I only brought the cutlery, ma'am, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss Marple, ever observant, let the moment stretch before responding. Sir Cedric is very particular about his spices, isn't he? She noted almost idly, as though talking about something mundane. Millie nodded quickly, her fingers gripping the mop handle tighter. Always to the left of his station, she muttered, the words tumbling out in a rush. He said it was muscle memory. Miss Marple's gaze softened, her expression a mix of understanding and calculation. And yet the salt, it was missing. Just like that. The words landed with quiet precision, and Millie's breath caught in her throat. Her shoulders slumped slightly as though the weight of that truth had begun to settle on her chest. I didn't touch it, miss, she whispered, almost pleading. I swear. Miss Marple's eyes never left the girl, studying her every movement, every flicker of emotion that passed across her face. Fear, yes, that was unmistakable. But was it guilt? Miss Marple was not so sure. What she did know was that fear often masked something more complex, something darker. Don't worry, child, Miss Marple said gently, her voice now full of quiet reassurance. Truth has a way of rising to the surface like cream. With that she turned and left the girl to her thoughts, her mop, and the deepening mystery. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the kitchen again, this time under the pretext of delivering a new sponge cake recipe to the cook. She exchanged pleasantries with the bustling staff, but her eyes were constantly darting about, scanning the familiar surroundings for anything amiss. And there it was, a small detail that might have been overlooked by others, but not by her. Sir Cedric's personal recipe book sat on the open shelf, its thick, well-thumbed pages resting in neat order. But one section caught her eye. The page marked risotto variations was missing, not torn or crumpled, but cleanly ripped out. No sign of a careless mishap, no ragged edges, just a deliberate removal, as if someone had planned this absence with precision. Miss Marple made no comment on the missing page, but the knowledge settled in her mind, its implications heavy and far-reaching. A missing recipe, a missing ingredient, and a dead man. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was still incomplete. As the cook prattled on about baking temperatures, Miss Marple excused herself with a soft smile, her mind already racing. It wasn't just a theft, it was an erasure, a deliberate effort to remove something that could tie a person to something far more sinister. The mystery deepened with every passing moment, every quiet exchange in the kitchen. She wasn't done yet though. Miss Marple's sharp instincts led her to the stove, where the air carried the faint, acrid scent of something burned. It was out of place, too harsh for the sweet aromas of pastries that should have filled the air. With practiced ease, she opened the lower chamber of the old cast-iron range and peered inside. There, among the ashes, was a blackened scrap of what had once been a recipe. Most of the writing had been charred beyond recognition, but one word stood out in faint relief. Correct. It was barely legible, yet it was enough. Miss Marple studied it in silence. Correct. The word echoed in her mind. Sir Cedric's risotto recipe had contained no such ingredient, nor had any other dish prepared that day mentioned it. Was this a clue, or a deliberate distraction? Whoever had removed the page from the recipe book had not simply stolen information. They had gone to great lengths to obscure the truth, to hide something that could point to the killer. Was it a red herring, meant to confuse the investigation? Or had someone destroyed a crucial piece of the puzzle, one that could unravel the timeline and reveal the murderer? The charred scrap, despite its near-total destruction, held secrets. It was a clue, yes, but a deliberately misleading one. Miss Marple could feel the weight of it, the tension that lingered in the air as the mystery unfolded layer by layer. The kitchen had returned to its normal rhythm, the clink of spoons against bowls, and the bubbling of saucers filling the air. But to Miss Marple, it felt charged with unspoken questions. Every detail mattered now. Every missing piece, every deliberate omission. And she knew that the truth, hidden beneath the surface, was waiting to rise like cream, ready to reveal itself at last. The villagers of Gresham Hall had always whispered about the strained relationship between Colonel Redden and his niece, Dorothy. While she was known for her gentle demeanor, few could ignore the simmering tension that had long existed beneath the surface. It was said that the Colonel treated Dorothy more as a servant than as family, her life largely confined to managing the household as if it were her sole purpose. Just the day before the fatal incident, onlookers had overheard a sharp exchange between the two outside the post office. Colonel Redden's voice had been laced with anger, chastising Dorothy for her plans to leave for London with her fiancé. Dorothy, rarely known to assert herself, had replied with a rare steely resolve, her words cutting through the cold air. "I won't live in this house forever." The row had been public yet brief. No one suspected it would be the last time anyone would see the Colonel in good health. With the man's sudden death just hours after their argument, rumors spread like wildfire. Was it mere coincidence? Or had Dorothy, in her quiet desperation, seized an opportunity to free herself from years of emotional restraint? Miss Marple, ever the observer, requested a private audience with Dorothy, and found her in a state of subdued composure. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, but there was something in the way she carried herself, something almost imperceptible, that spoke of a burden lifted. Dorothy's sorrow seemed genuine, but there was also a faint trace of relief that she couldn't quite hide. When questioned, she freely admitted to the argument, confessing her resentment with unusual openness. "I never hated him, Miss Marple," she murmured, her voice steady, but there was a certain detachment that made her words ring hollow. "But I didn't love him either. I don't think anyone ever did." Miss Marple studied her, noting the exhaustion in her tone, a weariness that seemed to weigh her down. A woman who had long been under the thumb of a man whose presence had defined her existence. It was easy to imagine that resentment had festered over the years, yet Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions. Murder, she mused, wasn't often the result of mere frustration or irritation. It was something deeper, more calculated, and more sinister. It was Mrs. Bantry's offhand comment, shared over a quiet tray of crumpets, that truly sparked Miss Marple's thoughts in an entirely new direction. "I saw Dorothy's young man at the fete," Mrs. Bantry had said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "A very modern-looking fellow, Henry something. He refused to taste the risotto. Said he was allergic to tree nuts." The detail caught Miss Marple's attention like a hook. "Allergic?" Mrs. Bantry nodded gravely. "Apparently, poor boy swells up like a bellows at the mere whiff of a walnut." Miss Marple didn't react, but the wheels in her mind began to turn. She recalled Sir Cedric's risotto, the one that had killed the Colonel. Walnuts, finely ground, were a key ingredient, lending the dish its earthy flavor. If Dorothy had intended to harm her uncle, it seemed highly unlikely that she would have risked poisoning her own fiancé in the process. After all, Henry had been standing nearby, and anyone tampering with the food wouldn't have known who might taste it first. This wasn't a careless mistake. It was deliberate, targeted, and well thought out. Whoever had altered the dish had done so with careful precision, certain of their intended victim. If Dorothy wasn't the one behind the Colonel's death, then someone else had orchestrated it. Someone far more calculating, Miss Marple thought as she surveyed the scene, piecing together the fragments of this increasingly complex puzzle. Days passed, and Miss Marple's thoughts never strayed far from the mystery. It wasn't until she found herself once again in the tranquil churchyard, beneath the arching yew trees, that she had the chance to speak with Reverend Allerton. This time, however, she didn't ask him about the fete. Instead, she inquired about his conversation with the Colonel just the morning before. "I understand you had quite a pointed exchange with Colonel Redden," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet curiosity. Allerton sighed heavily, his face drawn with the weight of memory. We did, he confessed, his voice tinged with an almost palpable regret. Tobias had discovered that I had reallocated some of the parish funds for the winter coal allowance. Unofficially, of course. He accused me of misconduct, and threatened to make it public. He called me a pious embezzler. I told him he had no idea what it was like to be cold in January with children to feed. The Reverend's voice wavered, but not with guilt, Miss Marple noted. It was pride. Wounded pride, perhaps. But pride nonetheless. And yet, you kept your distance at the fete, Miss Marple said gently, her tone almost coaxing. Allerton looked down, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. I had to, he replied. I knew how it would look. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing me squirm. There was honesty in his voice, but Miss Marple sensed something more beneath the surface, a deep well of emotions he had kept hidden, and perhaps an unspoken motive that no one had yet uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together in strange ways. There was Dorothy, her resentment clear but insufficient for murder. There was the mysterious fiancé, who had more to his presence than met the eye. And then there was Allerton, whose quiet pride and wounded dignity had placed him in direct conflict with the Colonel. But none of it, not even the revelations, seemed to be the full picture. Miss Marple paused, letting the silence hang between them as she pieced together her observations. The threads were there, faint but undeniable, leading to a far more intricate conclusion. Something told her that the key to the Colonel's death was hidden in plain sight. Perhaps the only thing left to do was wait for the truth to surface, and when it did, it would be more astonishing than anyone could imagine. The tranquil quiet of Gresham Hall's kitchen had returned, the vibrant bustle of the fete, now a mere memory, replaced by the dull hum of routine. The scent of saffron and rosemary had faded, giving way to the more pedestrian aromas of simmering soups and rising dough. Miss Marple arrived under the guise of sharing a new scone recipe. Lemon and lavender, an old-fashioned combination she felt deserved rediscovery. Mrs. Withers, the robust cook, accepted the handwritten note with a good-natured chuckle, her eyes twinkling as she set about preparing tea for her guest. As the steam curled from the teapot, Miss Marple's gaze, sharp and perceptive, wandered to the spice shelf. It was immaculate, neatly organized jars with labels in Cedric's elegant handwriting. But one thing seemed off. She casually remarked on the shelf's orderliness, which prompted Mrs. Withers to recount the Colonel's infamous fussiness about his ingredients, particularly his insistence on locking the spice rack. The cook's voice softened as she remembered how Sir Cedric had kept the key on a chain around his neck, always within reach but never out of sight. Miss Marple's attention, however, was focused on the tiny lock that adorned the spice rack. It was meant to be locked, but there was no key, no sign of tampering. Yet somehow, the contents had been disturbed. Someone had accessed it, and someone had done so with purpose. Hours later, Miss Marple found herself standing in the dimly lit scullery, her conversation with Millie Dawson still fresh in her mind. The young girl, hunched over a pile of napkins, looked like a picture of obedience, yet her eyes betrayed the tension she held beneath her calm exterior. The conversation began innocuously enough, with Miss Marple praising the soothing rhythm of folding linen. But when the spice rack was mentioned, Millie's fingers froze, her expression briefly clouded with guilt. She admitted that the rack had indeed been left unlocked the day before the fete, something Sir Cedric would never have permitted. She had seen it herself, had even noticed the salt tin was different, smaller, and lacking a label. It was a subtle detail, easily overlooked, but one that could spell the difference between life and death. Miss Marple's thoughts turned inward as she reassured Millie that fear could be a form of courage when it prompted the truth to surface. That evening, with Mrs. Withers absent, and the house cloaked in an unusual stillness, Miss Marple found herself poring over Cedric's notebooks, pretending an interest in his culinary philosophy. The notebooks were filled with extravagant notations, lists of flavor pairings, and highbrow musings on aromatic violence. Yet one small leather-bound journal caught her eye. It was different, more reserved perhaps, but also more purposeful. The pages within contained not just recipes, but cryptic jottings, suggesting something darker beneath the surface, a hint of a man who knew more than he let on. As Miss Marple read between the lines, she sensed a thread of something sinister, something carefully concealed within the folds of Cedric's culinary genius. What had been stirred in that kitchen wasn't just a dish, but a carefully orchestrated game of intrigue, a dangerous manipulation that had only just begun to reveal its deadly nature. With every detail, the mystery deepened, and with every turn of the page, the stakes grew higher. The pieces were slowly aligning, and soon Miss Marple would uncover the truth buried beneath the spices and secrets of Gresham Hall. Behind a tin of cumin, Miss Marple discovered a forgotten notebook, its cover marked only by the faintest smudge, a stark contrast to the glossy modern recipe cards neatly stacked beside it. The pages inside, written with a careful, deliberate hand, were filled with older versions of Sir Cedric's prized dishes that had been forgotten, or rather purposefully concealed. Among them was a first draft of the infamous risotto de la Horte, a dish that had become synonymous with his name, praised for its delicate balance of flavors and fragrant oils. But this earlier version told a different story. Its ingredients were starkly simpler: borio rice, saffron stock, parmesan, and a final drizzle of walnut oil. There was no nutmeg. Yet several villagers, especially those who had eaten the dish at the fete, commented on a sharp, almost medicinal aftertaste. Cedric had dismissed their concerns, assuring them that his recipe was unchanged. Yet this was clearly a lie. If someone had recreated this earlier, unaltered version, they would have missed the nuance that Cedric had added over the years. Nutmeg, the essential final touch that transformed the dish. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her mind turning over the implication. The presence of nutmeg, or rather, its absence in this older recipe, suggested an intentional alteration. The tampering had not been about creating something entirely new, but in recreating a forgotten recipe, with deadly precision. Whoever had done this had known enough to alter the balance, but not enough to realize the danger. A deadly pinch of nutmeg could turn an innocent dish into a lethal weapon. The revelation weighed heavily on Miss Marple, but there was more to discover. Later, that evening, in the solitude of her own parlor, Miss Marple returned to the subject of nutmeg, her thoughts flickering to a medical reference book gifted to her by her late brother, a chemist. She had marked the page long ago, its stark description of the dangers of nutmeg now echoing in her mind. Small amounts used in cooking were harmless, but in large quantities, it could cause dizziness, nausea, and even, in rare cases, death. This wasn't a case of poison slipped into a drink or a needle in the dark. This was subtler, far more insidious. The spice had been used not for flavor, but for murder. She'd seen it clearly now. The missing salt shaker at the fete, the odd replacement, and the heavy-handed addition of the toxic spice. The killer had crafted the crime with a culinary hand, altering a recipe that was meant to be perfect. It was not arsenic or cyanide that had killed Colonel Redden, but the ghost of a forgotten recipe, resurrected with tragic intent. The next morning, Miss Marple returned to Gresham Hall's kitchen, her quiet determination as unwavering as ever. She casually asked Mrs. Withers about the salt. The cook, still puzzled by Miss Marple's earlier inquiries, explained that there were 2 shakers in rotation. The one with the blue stripes, reserved for Sir Cedric, always on the left, and the other, the plain shaker, kept on the shelf near the flour bins. It was rarely used, its label faded and forgotten. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the shelf, where the unmarked shaker now sat on the opposite side of the station, where Sir Cedric had been preparing his dishes. The exact spot where he had claimed in the heat of the moment that he couldn't find his usual salt. The shaker, plain and unremarkable, looked innocuous, yet it stood out in its wrongness. It was out of place, and it had not been part of Cedric's meticulous organization. Miss Marple inquired gently if anyone had used it recently. Mrs. Withers frowned, casting her memory back. "Not that I know of. Sir Cedric is very particular about his ingredients. He said seasoning is all about instinct. about habit. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts already racing ahead. A second shaker, unlabeled, displaced from its original spot, an unnoticed change, perhaps, but one that could have been fatal. This seemingly small alteration had been the killer's key mistake. By tampering with the spice rack, and replacing the salt with something far more deadly, the murderer had attempted to cover their tracks, but in doing so, had left behind the very clue that would unravel the entire plot. With each new detail, the web of mystery tightened, and Miss Marple, as ever, knew that the truth was close, just a few more pieces to place, and the killer's identity would be revealed, not through brute force, but through the delicate, dangerous art of cooking. In the dim-lit kitchen of Gresham Hall, with its faint smell of simmering stock, and the occasional clink of mismatched silverware, Miss Marple stood observing the subtle patterns of movement, the flickers of tension among the gathered staff. It was there, amid the subdued murmurs and shifting glances, that the seed of her suspicion took root. Someone had tampered with the routine, had manipulated the smallest of details, with an exactness that could only be deliberate. Her mind wandered back to the event, to the hastily prepared risotto, that had been served with such careful precision, only to end in tragedy. Colonel Redden's sudden collapse was the scene that played over and over in her mind, the sharpness of his breath, the horrifying spasm that betrayed the deadly nature of what had been consumed. The key, Miss Marple knew, was not in the risotto itself, but in the subtle missteps, the inconspicuous changes that had been made without a second thought. She recalled the salt shaker, innocuous yet pivotal, placed wrongly that fateful day, moved out of instinctual habit by someone unfamiliar with the kitchen's rhythm, someone who lacked the knowledge of Sir Cedric's meticulous arrangements. A left-handed chef, whose every motion was choreographed with the care of a master, could never have made such a mistake. It was an oversight born of ignorance, not malice, and that was what had exposed the true culprit. Someone who had once worked quietly in the shadows, someone who had memorized the original recipe long before it had been altered. The unlabeled salt shaker, unmistakably out of place, had not been the result of an error. It had been the first clue. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Millie Dawson, the quiet kitchen maid, who had been there, invisible and unnoticed, just as the old sleuth had suspected. The young woman had been part of the kitchen long before Sir Cedric had come with his grand airs and new ideas. She had seen the original recipe, the one that still lingered in the folds of her memory, perhaps scrawled down long ago in the secrecy of her own thoughts. Nutmeg, once an innocent pinch, had now become the deadly key, added by someone who hadn't known the revised recipe, and who had believed the version with the sharp spice was the one to follow. Miss Marple knew that the murder had not been an impulsive act. It had been calculated, steeped in old wounds and bitterness that had fermented over the years. A simple act of salt shaker misplacement had been the cover-up, but the true motive ran deeper, woven into the threads of resentment and long-buried secrets. And so, when the room was quiet, with all eyes on her, Miss Marple spoke the words that would bring the darkness into the light. Her voice, soft but unyielding, filled the room as she pieced together the chilling truth, revealing the unseen tragedy. A child, scorned by a father, had crafted the perfect poison not out of malice, but out of a twisted kind of justice, and with it, had sealed her fate, and the fate of Colonel Redden forever. In the stillness of Gresham Hall's drawing-room, with the late afternoon light, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors, Miss Marple stood with a calm demeanor that belied the intensity of the truth she was about to unfold. She had always known that the smallest details, an unspoken glance, an errant gesture, a misplaced object, could tell the story more profoundly than words ever could. The death of Colonel Redden had not been a mere accident, or a random misfortune. It had been meticulously orchestrated, hidden in plain sight, like a well-placed breadcrumb, leading back to the kitchen where it all began. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, swept the room as she began, her voice steady and measured. What happened that night, she began softly, was no accident. It was an act of deliberate revenge, masked in the form of a dish so familiar, so comforting, that no one suspected its lethal twist. A small murmur rippled through the gathered guests, but Miss Marple pressed on. It was the risotto. But not the risotto Sir Cedric had served. The recipe was altered. Yes, but not by him. It was someone who knew it before the changes. Someone who had been invisible for far too long. She moved slowly toward the table, where an old, faded recipe rested beneath a glass paperweight, its edges curling slightly with age. This, she continued, tapping the paper gently, is the original version of risotto della morte. It's very similar to the final one, but with one crucial difference, the inclusion of nutmeg. A stunned silence fell over the room as she turned her gaze towards Sir Cedric. You see, Cedric stopped using nutmeg in the dish years ago. It clashed with the walnut oil, he said. Too strong, too aggressive. But someone who hadn't kept up with his changes, someone who clung to the older version, would never have known that. And that someone, I believe, made the mistake of adding it in excessive amounts. Sir Cedric, his brow furrowing in confusion, spoke up. But who would? Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. The salt, she said, her tone unwavering. It was the salt shaker that was moved. To someone unfamiliar with Cedric's routine, it would seem a minor detail. But to anyone who truly knew him, it was a glaring mistake. Cedric always reached for the salt with his left hand, his station meticulously organized. The shaker should have been placed on the left, but instead it was found on the right. This wasn't a mistake, but a deliberate alteration, made by someone who did not understand the rhythm of his kitchen. Her eyes locked on Millie, who had been sitting in silence the entire time, her hands folded tightly in her lap. You, Miss Marple said quietly, were the one who made that mistake, not out of carelessness, but out of ignorance. Ignorance of Cedric's routine. But that wasn't all, was it, Millie? Millie's hands trembled slightly, her knuckles turning white. You knew the recipe. The older version. You knew it because you had once watched it being made, perhaps even memorized it. You had been invisible, a shadow in that kitchen. And when the time came, when the bitterness of your past and the neglect of your father weighed too heavily on you, you used what you knew best to create your revenge. Millie looked up at her, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear, and something deeper, something older, something rooted in a past long buried. Miss Marple's voice softened, though her words were no less piercing. You knew that Colonel Redden was your father, but he had denied you, dismissed you, and left your mother to struggle in silence. And when he returned to this village, playing the part of a noble man, you remained unseen, washing his floors, erasing his guilt with each passing day. The room was deathly silent, the weight of Miss Marple's words sinking deep into the hearts of those present. And so when the chance came, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, you reached for the only weapon you had left. Not a knife, not poison in the conventional sense, but the recipe, the old one, the one filled with the memory of your grief and your bitterness. Nutmeg, added in excess, not for flavor, but for destruction. The salt shaker moved to the wrong side, as if in a dance that only you knew, a dance of vengeance that you had rehearsed in the shadows of your past. Miss Marple paused, allowing the gravity of her words to settle over the room. Millie, her face now streaked with tears, did not speak. She only stared ahead, her lips quivering with the weight of her guilt, her silence more telling than any confession. Sometimes, Miss Marple murmured, it's not the kitchen that tells the story. It's the people who live in its shadow. With that, she folded her hands, her gaze softening, as she looked toward Millie one last time. The room remained still, heavy with the truth that had finally been brought to light. Miss Marple's eyes were sharp as they scanned the room, her gaze lingering on each person present. She seemed to draw the very tension out of the air, turning it into something almost tangible, something the others could not escape. She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft, but every word heavy with meaning. You see, my dear friends, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, the past is like a shadow. It might be long forgotten by most, but it never leaves. It follows, waits for the right moment, and when the time comes it speaks loud enough for all to hear. She paused, allowing her words to sink in, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Every person felt the weight of her gaze, but her focus was now on Milly, who was sitting unnervingly still, her face pale, her eyes downcast. Miss Marple continued, as if speaking directly to her, though she addressed the entire room. Years ago, Milly, your mother worked in a nearby estate, a young maid, eager and full of life, and then one day, she simply vanished. No one ever spoke of it openly, of course, but there were whispers, murmurings in the corners of the village. Colonel Redden's name was always attached to those whispers, though none dared to speak it aloud. And soon after, a position opened up right here at Gresham Hall. How curious, don't you think? The room fell silent, as though the air itself had thickened with unspoken truths. Milly's gaze remained fixed on the floor, but her fingers twitched, betraying her inner turmoil. Her hands, tightly clasped in her lap, were the only sign of the emotional battle raging within her. Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her words remained sharp. You were left behind, Milly. You were the one who scrubbed floors, while the world outside continued, oblivious to your existence. And all the while, Colonel Redden continued to parade around as the pillar of decency in the village, with never a single acknowledgement of you. Milly's breath hitched, but she remained silent. The truth was too painful to confront, too heavy to express. Yet Miss Marple's next words sliced through the room with a clarity that no one could ignore. He never acknowledged you, Miss Marple repeated, her voice low but piercing. He paid for silence, not love. You were left in the shadows of his life, while he walked through this village, as though he had no secrets to hide. But blood, my dear, does not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. The neglect, Miss Marple's voice softened, her tone almost compassionate now. The neglect leaves bruises deeper than anyone realizes. It scars the soul in a way that even time cannot heal. A single tear, delicate and quiet, slid down Milly's cheek, but her lips remained sealed, her face betraying nothing more. Miss Marple said nothing more on the matter, her gaze full of understanding, no judgment in her eyes. In that moment, she held the truth in her hands like a fragile piece of glass. The silence was deafening, and then Miss Marple continued, her voice calm but insistent. The crime we are speaking of here was not born of fear or money. It was not an impulsive act of passion or jealousy. No, the motive was much deeper, much more enduring. It was a matter of years spent in the shadows of rejection, of a lifetime spent in the service of the very man who should have recognized her, who should have seen her as his daughter, yet he never did. Milly's fingers clenched tighter in her lap, her face a mask of stillness, yet the very air around her seemed to hum with the weight of her resentment. This was not a crime of opportunity, Miss Marple continued, her eyes never leaving Milly. This was the work of someone who had lived a life of near invisibility, a life where even the smallest desire for recognition had been cruelly ignored. And then at last, Milly had the perfect opportunity. She knew the kitchen, she knew the routines, she knew the layout of Sir Cedric's kitchen better than anyone. She had observed him, she had helped prepare the very dish that would later seal his fate. Lady Florence, unable to hold her thoughts any longer, leaned forward and whispered, "But why now? Why wait all this time?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Lady Florence, her expression kind but unwavering. "Because the moment was public," Miss Marple answered, her voice growing firmer. "The fete was an event to be witnessed. Colonel Redden was always the loudest, when it came to judgment, always eager to humiliate those beneath him. Perhaps he threatened Milly again. Perhaps it was a cruel remark. Or perhaps she simply could no longer bear the invisible chains that bound her. Perhaps she could not live with the silence any longer." The room was still, every face turned toward Miss Marple. "And so she used what she had," Miss Marple continued, her silence, her knowledge, the forgotten recipe. "She was not a murderer in the traditional sense. She did not need a weapon. She used her mind, her memory, and the very thing that she knew would push Colonel Redden to the edge, the dish he adored. But there was one mistake, one flaw in her plan." Miss Marple's voice dropped, a sense of finality settling over her words. "The nutmeg," she said softly. You see, Sir Cedric had not used nutmeg for years. The dish, once filled with the aromatic spice, had long since been altered. Milly had recreated it from memory, from the version of the recipe she had known, the one that once called for nutmeg. But the change had already been made. The nutmeg was no longer a part of it. Sir Cedric's face drained of color as the gravity of her words hit him. I haven't used nutmeg for years," he muttered, his voice shaking. Miss Marple nodded gravely. Exactly. And yet someone remembered the dish as it once was, as it had been, and in doing so, they sealed the fate of the man who had never once looked them in the eye. The mistake, the tragic flaw, was that forgotten detail. The nutmeg. The poison, you see, was never meant to be in that quantity. But in that moment, it was lethal. And so in that instant, Milly's revenge was complete. The room fell into an eerie quiet, every person contemplating the enormity of the act, the depth of the resentment that had been cultivated for so long. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her eyes remained steady, piercing, and full of quiet understanding. "It was almost the perfect crime," she said, her voice soft, like a mere whisper. "So quiet, so plausible, so well timed. But one error, just one mistake, undid it all." Her gaze flicked to Milly, whose eyes were still cast down, her face an unreadable mask. "Nutmeg," Miss Marple whispered, her voice barely audible now, but the room could hear it clearly. That was the fatal flaw. Sir Cedric blinked rapidly, the weight of realization slowly sinking in. That amount," he stammered, his voice choked with horror. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, in that quantity. It was never meant to be anything but deadly." Milly remained still, her face frozen, but inside the truth had been laid bare. The crime, the motive, and the perpetrator. It was all here, and Miss Marple had exposed it for all to see. The silence in the room now spoke volumes. Miss Marple's gaze cut through the room with surgical precision, her eyes locking onto each individual, as if peeling back their thoughts layer by layer. "It wasn't the poison that killed him, you know," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "But the bitterness alone." Her words hung in the air, a stark reminder of the deeper poison that had simmered long before the fatal meal. Several guests exchanged uneasy glances, the faint tang of something unnatural still lingering in the back of their throats. A few had only taken a bite, but the Colonel, his gluttonous appetite, as inflated as his arrogance, had devoured a full helping. The result was inevitable. Dorothy's hand instinctively shot to her mouth, a gasp escaping her, while Lady Florence turned away, as though she could somehow distance herself from the horrors that Miss Marple had unveiled. Had Milly known, Miss Marple continued, her eyes now piercing Milly with quiet, but undeniable intensity. Had she checked the new recipe, had she known that the nutmeg had been removed, she might have failed. But she didn't check. She trusted her memory more than the man who changed the dish. And in that one careless oversight, the past betrayed her. The room, once filled with murmurs and whispers, now stood in suspended silence. Time itself seemed to stretch as Milly, trembling, finally spoke. Her voice, thin and strained, broke the stillness. "He used to pass me every day, never even a glance. Not once, not one word." Her breath hitched, and her hands clenched together, as if to hold herself together. "I used to think maybe he didn't know, maybe he didn't remember. But he knew, he always knew." There was no interruption, no attempt to quiet her. She continued, her voice growing more fragile with each passing moment. "I hated him. I tried to tell myself I didn't, but I did. I hated the way he looked at the world like it owed him something. Like people like me were invisible. And when I saw him sitting there, smug and laughing at that poor man's risotto, like it was a joke, something inside me snapped." She lowered her head, as if to hide the raw emotion that was finally escaping. "I found the recipe in his drawer, weeks ago. I remembered how he used to talk about nutmeg, how he loved it in his meals. I thought, if I made it just like that, it would be poetic. He would never know it was me, but he would know something, somehow. Tears slid down her cheeks, but she made no sound, no plea for mercy, no excuse. She simply stared at Miss Marple, her face a mask of sorrow and resolve. Sir Cedric, sitting across the room, stood abruptly, as if to speak, but found himself struck silent, too shaken to form a coherent thought. Lady Florence, pale as a ghost, rang the bell for the constable, her hand trembling visibly. Milly made no attempt to flee. She simply met Miss Marple's gaze with a quiet resignation. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered, the weight of the words sinking into the room like an anchor. "I just wanted him to taste what he left behind." Miss Marple's expression was unreadable, a quiet sorrow lingering behind her composed demeanor. She gave no reply, for there was nothing left to say. The room was filled with a weighty stillness. No relief, no satisfaction, only the tragic weight of a truth too long buried. As Milly was led away by the constable, the silence in the room deepened, not in the relief of a mystery solved, but in the recognition of the heartbreak behind it. Lady Florence, her life now forever marked by this tragedy, faded further into the shadows of the village. Invitations ceased. Her once vibrant social calendar was a ghost of its former self. The grand drawing room of Gresham Hall stood shuttered, no longer a place of lively gatherings. Lady Florence was seen walking alone in the garden, her parasol lowered not to shield from the sun, but from the intrusive weight of public curiosity. No one spoke ill of her directly, but the whispers that followed her were louder than any words. The scandal, though brief, had left its indelible mark. Her dignified silence became a mask, but under it, the strain of public opinion was too much to bear. Sir Cedric, too, though officially cleared, found his reputation irrevocably tarnished. His once charming flamboyance became a caricature of itself, no longer inspiring admiration but eye rolls and whispers. The scandal had clung to him like a stain that no amount of wit could scrub away. His grand culinary tour, once heralded as a triumph, was quietly cancelled, and the cookbook that was supposed to captivate the world was shelved indefinitely. "I shall retreat," he was overheard muttering, "into quieter affairs." Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, had seen it all. She knew well that dignity was a fragile thing, something that could unravel with the slightest tug of scandal. For Lady Florence, the cost of hosting a tragedy was far greater than she could have ever imagined. The truth had been exposed, but not in triumph. Justice had been served, but with an undeniable sorrow, a quiet understanding of how deeply the past could poison even the most polished of lives. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her fingers delicately cradling the fine china cup, her eyes flickering across the room as if catching glimpses of a deeper truth. Sir Cedric's recovery, she suspected, would not be immediate. Such vanity had a way of bouncing back, often with even greater force. But the lesson had been severe, and in the quiet aftermath, the flamboyant facade that had once dazzled the world now seemed a little less solid. For someone whose life was built on such a delicate performance, a single misstep could cause the entire act to unravel. And in this case, it was a literal dish, one that had been served with pride, but had brought down the curtain on his carefully constructed life. Dorothy Redfern, though, was already slipping out of the tangled web of the scandal. As she left Gresham Hall, there was no sense of drama in her departure, no heartfelt farewells, no public displays of emotion. With only a modest travel case in hand, and Henry at her side, she boarded the train to London with the quiet resolve of someone who had learned long ago to be invisible. There were no tears, no backward glances, only the hum of the train and the weight of decisions that had already been made. Miss Marple, standing on the station platform, offered no words, just a firm handshake, and a shared look that said more than any conversation could. Dorothy would never speak of Milly again. She had already buried that chapter deep within herself. But the grief they both carried had a way of softening the sharp edges of the past, and in time, Dorothy might find solace, not in forgetting, but in the act of rebuilding. She had spent so many years in the Colonel's shadow, bound by expectations she could never meet. Now, for the first time, she was free to live her own story. A few days later, in the tranquil conservatory of Mrs. Bantry's old vicarage, the faint aroma of freshly brewed tea filled the air. Miss Marple sat across from her friend, the sunlight dancing across the room in a golden haze, as they shared a plate of seed cake. Mrs. Bantry, dabbing her lips delicately, looked at Miss Marple with admiration. "Well, Jane, you've done it again," she said, her voice full of awe. "I don't know how you always manage to see these things." Miss Marple smiled softly, her fingers stirring the tea in slow, deliberate circles. "It's not about seeing, it's about noticing," she replied, her voice calm and thoughtful. "Most people overlook the little things, the smallest details that slip right by them." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, intrigued. "But poison in a salt shaker, it's like something out of a novel." Miss Marple's eyes softened as she took a small sip of her tea. "Yes, but this was no novel," she said quietly. "It was the culmination of years, slowly simmering in silence, in bitterness, in neglect." She paused, her gaze drifting out of the window, where daffodils swayed gently in the breeze. "People often think that murder requires rage, or greed, or some grand motive," she continued, her tone contemplative. "But sometimes, it's much smaller than that. It's a quiet kind of poison, a slow erosion of hope, a life unloved, unseen." Mrs. Bantry's eyes grew soft with sympathy. "Poor girl," she murmured, shaking her head. "And poor Redfern, even if he was difficult." Miss Marple nodded, her expression distant. "Yes, justice was served, I think," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But justice is never as neat as people imagine. It doesn't fit into tidy boxes. It leaves its marks in ways that no one can predict." She paused again, watching the daffodils sway outside, as if waiting for the breeze to carry away the lingering weight of the conversation. "And besides," she added quietly, "a recipe is a delicate thing. One wrong pinch of salt, one misplaced ingredient, and the whole thing can go terribly wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, as the room fell silent, both women lost in thought, knowing that some truths could only be understood when seen in the quiet spaces between the lines. Spring settled over St. Mary Mead, like a soft warm quilt, quiet, bright and stitched with the routine of daily life. The scandal was spoken of in hushed tones now, a whisper lost in time, and the villagers, ever fond of tidy endings, slowly tucked the memory away, folding it neatly into the drawers of their minds, lined with lavender to mask its scent. Miss Marple, as always, returned to her needlework, to the comfort of tea, and to her solitary walks through the village, where hedges bloomed in heavy fragrant abundance. The days were peaceful once more, but beneath the calm, her mind remained sharp as her knitting needles, always alert, always listening. For in St. Mary Mead, even the gentlest breeze might carry with it the faintest trace of something stirring in the air, something that could never be fully contained by the ticking of the clock. And Miss Marple, ever the silent observer, was always watching, always waiting for the next ripple in the still waters. Justice, she knew, was never served with the loud fury of a storm. It was a quiet grace, the kind that only someone like her could fully understand. In this village, even the most elegant of tea parties could hide a century of unspoken pain, and sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room wasn't the sharpest of knives, but a memory, buried deep in the heart, festering in silence. The story of Millie Dawson wasn't just about a fatal dish, or a forgotten pinch of spice. It was about the invisible weight carried by those who are never seen, never acknowledged, whose pain is so deeply buried that it poisons everything it touches. Millie didn't kill out of greed or madness, she acted out of the silence that had stretched across years, until one forgotten page in a cookbook became the silent stage for an unspoken grief. Miss Marple had once said that evil rarely makes its entrance with a thunderclap. It walks in quietly, disguised as something as harmless as routine. But in the smallest of details, the missing salt, the misremembered habits, the names left unspoken, that's where the truth would eventually reveal itself. And in Millie's case, that truth was a tragic tale of a woman cast aside, forgotten, forced to live in the shadows of others, never allowed to be seen or heard. If you had been in her place, ignored and silenced for so long, would you have sought to make yourself heard? Or would you have simply faded into the background, a ghost in your own life? The twist, hidden beneath layers of sorrow, silence, and simmering resentment, was a revelation that caught many off guard. Did you suspect Millie all along, or did the truth take you by surprise? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did you see the clues that were left behind, or were they too subtle for you to catch? What would you have done, in her shoes? If this slow-burning mystery, filled with hidden motives, unspoken grief, and Miss Marple's signature charm, captivated you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that peel back the layers of human nature, one clue at a time. Share this story with friends who love a classic whodunit, and let's bring more mystery lovers into the fold. Thank you for watching, and until the next case, stay curious.